This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hannan.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, the Middle East is continuing to be refigured. The ceasefire between Israel and Iran continues to hold despite complete instability in the region. We won't have time to talk about that tape because there's lots of other news going on, including ongoing ceasefire talks that appear to be starting in Qatar between the Israeli military and Hamas. We're going to be covering those stories, but some other stories first, including a documentary that the BBC has refused to air showing the targeting, detainment, and torture of medical personnel in Gaza by Israeli authorities. It was broadcast on Channel 4, but the BBC, despite its involvement with it, has seeking to distance itself from that. It's causing quite a controversy. In addition to that, 400 media figures, including 111 current BBC employees, are calling for the removal of the BBC board member Sir Robbie Gibb, alleging his ties to the Jewish Chronicle, which compromised BBC's Gaza coverage. And then we're going to cover a really groundbreaking report from one of our former interviewees, Jamal. You know, rapporteur Francesca Albanese has published a report that exposes corporate forces behind the destruction of Palestine and the occupation and destruction of Gaza, which have enriched, legitimized Israel's illegal presence and actions. It's quite a stunning report by the UN Special Rapporteur. Before we get to that, we're going to go to an interview that you did with Hicham Safieddine. He wrote an article in the Middle East Eye entitled Nawaf Salam is failing to rebuild Lebanon while bending to U.S.-Israeli interests. It's a very interesting article showing how Lebanon is basically bending to the whims of the new configured Middle East. It's a really good interview, Jamal.
That's right, Jess. And we talk about Palestine all the time, and of course, with a detour to what happened between Israel and the United States and Iran, we tend to forget to talk about Lebanon since the attack on Hezbollah. And now this is a great article just telling you what the status is like, because we're seeing happening behind the scenes, both in Syria and Lebanon, talks to normalize with Israel. I think Syria will, in my prediction, Syria will normalize first. Lebanon will have a tough time doing so. When Lebanon finally elected commander of Lebanon's armed forces, Joseph Aoun, as president, after 2 years of the office being vacant, he appointed Nawaf Salam as prime minister. Salam ran on an energized and hopeful message of rescue, reform, and rebuild to a country weary from war with Israel and teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. In addition, Salam had just finished a 6-year tenure as a judge on the International Court of Justice, and as its acting president in 2024, he presided over South Africa's case of genocide against Israel, for which he was widely praised. In his recent article in the Middle East Eye entitled, Nawaf Salam is failing to rebuild Lebanon while bending to U.S.-Israeli interests, Hicham Safieddine explains how Salam's tenure is disappointing on multiple fronts. He is Canada Research Chair in the History of the Modern Middle East and Associate Professor of History at the University of British Columbia. He is also the author of Banking on the State, the Financial Foundations of Lebanon. Welcome to Arab Talk, Hicham. So let me begin by asking you, can you first talk about the election of President Joseph Aoun as the commander of Lebanon's armed forces following Lebanon's ceasefire with Israel in 2024, and why he was also the favored candidate of global powerhouses such as Saudi Arabia and the United States, France as well?
Well, firstly, thank you, Jamal, for having me on your show. And I should tell the listeners that I am currently based in Lebanon, so if there's any interruption in terms of the internet, I hope they take it in stride. It's part of being here at the moment. In terms of your question about Joseph Aoun, Aoun has been a commander-in-chief of the armed forces for a very long time, and he's presided as army chief over several crises, namely, obviously, the war in Syria, which was something that impacted Lebanon's internal politics. He was also commander of the armed forces during the Lebanese uprising that happened after 2019, after the financial collapse. Throughout his tenure as army chief, he was very close to the Americans. In fact, close to 90% of aid that comes to the army comes from the United States. And Joseph Aoun has been, on one hand, extremely diplomatic and measured. He's taken a distance from politics, which is a smart and wise thing to do as head of the army. But at the same time, he's been slowly and gradually tying the Lebanese army to American foreign policy. And this is why it made him a favorite for the United States. Now, he was appointed by General Aoun, the previous General Michel Aoun, and he never kind of alienated any of the Lebanese powers. He also did not actively seek to undermine Hezbollah or the resistance in general. So overall, while he was aligned with the United States, he wasn't an antagonistic figure like somebody like Samir Jaja, who was the head of the Lebanese forces. Now, for all of these reasons, he was initially pushed for by the Americans and the Saudis, but he also, we have to mention, did manage to acquire the votes of the Hezbollah and other forces opposed to the United States, but only after the war, only after Israel had launched its devastating war in Lebanon, and the balance of power had become kind of destabilized. And so this was an opportune moment, and this is why he garners this support. And since then, as a matter of fact, he has generally spoken very, very favorably of Saudi Arabia. He has been joining the Arab leaders in their position towards the so-called two-state solution. He did not go to Iraq because Iraq was seen possibly as an Arab state that is not entirely basically allied to the Gulf regimes and Egypt. So he's playing this game, and he hasn't, I think he hasn't gone off script so far. He's been very generally pliant to US policy, except, and now we'll get to this maybe, not in the way that Salam has. He's been much more diplomatic and reserved.
Well, let's talk about Salam. Nawaf Salam gave a convincing message of economic rejuvenation and reform to a country that was financially broken before the war with Israel, which worsened the downward spiral. Has he taken any significant action that would address these? For example, reconstruction of areas bombed by Israel?
Not at all, quite the opposite. Since Salam came to power in January, he's spoken about reconstruction, but he hasn't taken any measure to actually implement or even to initiate for instance, a conference to collect funds or money for reconstruction. He's only been once to the south, where most of the destruction is. He's generally spending most of his time, as a matter of fact, attending galas and events in Beirut. And his language, as I write in my article, has been extremely, I would argue, antagonistic to the population or the communities that have suffered from Israeli attacks. So Salam has played so far a negative role. And I would argue his emphasis is not on rebuilding and reconstruction. His emphasis on disarming Hezbollah, and he puts it as the monopoly of arms. There's a discourse here in Lebanon about state building. It's extremely abstract. It's repetitive. It has no concrete content to it. I can tell you personally, I've had to go to courts for several reasons in the past 2 months. We still have like major courts without electricity. We still have dilapidated police stations. So even at the basic level of services, of state services, nothing is working. We can't blame him personally for all of this, but we can say that he hasn't initiated any new vision or any new plan neither for reconstruction nor for serious reform. There is some movement on the banking reform field or the portfolio. We can talk more about that. But overall, Salam has become a divisive figure, and he's generally antagonized most of the population that has suffered from the Israeli attacks.
Well, Lebanon did go back to the International Monetary Fund in February, which aligns it with U.S. interests. Eligibility comes with a list of reforms and accommodations. Incidentally, Hezbollah always opposed this. Your thoughts on this?
So let me begin by telling listeners that just a week or 2 weeks ago, the government of Salam lifted there are no subsidies on fuel here, increased the price of gas. And this is, of course, part of the general so-called reforms of removing any protection or any subsidy of basic needs like fuel. And so one of the measures that he took were opposed to supporting the middle class and the working class. And in terms of the IMF, this is the thing about Lebanese politics. We have an oligarchy in Lebanon that is reliant on import trade, and that is reliant on basically shadowy business. And they are so neoliberal and so vehemently pro-capitalist that they're kind of on the left of the IMF. So opposition to the IMF in Lebanon comes from various sources. It does come from the left. It does come sometimes from parties like Hezbollah, but I should also tell listeners that unfortunately, the economic struggle is not a priority for anyone, including those who support the resistance. So the Minister of Finance in Lebanon comes from the ML movement, which is an ally of Hezbollah. This minister has actually nominated a pro-American candidate for the central bank. This minister, Yassin Jaber, has very actively sought the support of the IMF. He's a right-wing minister, and he still hails from the camp that supports the resistance. So it's a bit complicated. The IMF is seen now as being peddled as the basically life savior of Lebanon, because once you get IMF approval, you might get more money coming in. But I can tell you that the amount of money needed to fix the Lebanese economy is much more than what the IMF can provide. The other concern, this has to do with the anti-colonial struggle in our part of the world. If you integrate your banking system into the international system, as you know, today financial sanctions, financial surveillance is a huge part of actually undermining any resistance to American empire and to Israel. So the concern is that we have a cash economy right now. This cash economy may be a hindrance to economic development, but in a sense, it is protecting certain communities from sanctions because they can then, buy and sell and live and spend without being monitored, even though there are ways to monitor cash payment because it's also a dollarized economy. Another point to make here is that Lebanon, as a result of 2019 crisis, has had a devaluation, a huge one, and everybody uses US dollars. So we see how on one at the same time, you've got this cash economy. It's hindering development, but so long as the formal system is under the control of the US proxies, there's this dilemma. What do? Do you stay with the cash economy and protect communities while at the same time, preventing possibly growth, or do you integrate? And my answer to all of this is we have to have a progressive politics of economic resistance. We need to understand how can we not only fight with the right with armed struggle, but how can we improve the conditions of people, economic conditions, without integrating into the U.S. Financial system.
Talk about Lebanon's normalizing relations with Israel. Nawaf Salam was highly regarded as the lead judge on the International Court of Justice when South Africa brought its case of genocide against Israel. Both he and President Aoun now state that they are unequivocally against this. Why do his actions say otherwise?
Well, let us begin by saying that Lebanon, since the 1970s, with the presence of the Palestinian Revolution and the presence of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, has taken a very strong opposed, not formal, not official Lebanon. I'm talking about the Lebanese people, particularly those that are in the south of Lebanon and those that were part of the movement for Arab nationalism. So we've had a strong anti-Israeli current. And as a result of repeated Israeli wars and occupations and invasions, there is a deep-rooted opposition to any form of so-called peace or normalization. And despite that, we've had one case of signing a peace treaty, a so-called peace treaty, in the 1980s by the pro-Israeli right-wing Falangist president. That was in the 80s, more than basically 40 years ago. But as a result of resistance, this accord was annulled. And since the liberation of South Lebanon in 2000, no one has dared to think or consider of signing a so-called peace treaty or normalize with Israel. What happened today as a result of the Israeli war and the major setbacks that Hezbollah and the pro-resistance camp faced, and because also of the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria and the potential, moderate, so to speak, position of the Syrian new government, we are seeing voices in Lebanon that are emboldened. And all of a sudden, they're saying that normalization is not a taboo. They're saying that we are tired of war. They're saying that we need to make peace. And so what Salam has done, and also Aoun, they have endorsed the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which adheres to the idea of a two-state solution. However, what Salam has done in his media interviews, he's argued that we have to go for peace, and then after peace, we can see normalization. So he's already providing a compromise while we can see that the Israelis are refusing any attempt to actually accept a Palestinian state. So Islam's position and Aoun's position, again, they are not proactively calling for normalization, but they're normalizing the idea of normalization by repeating the call for a so-called just and lasting peace and for the creation of a two-state solution. And the problem with this, Jamal, is not the call itself. It's the fact that it is being made while we have a genocide in Gaza. It's the fact that it's being made while we still have occupied territory in Lebanon, while we are facing just yesterday, 2 nights ago, Beirut's suburb was bombarded by the Israelis, and yet they are still extending their hand and they have no partner. So instead of actually, taking a stronger position, they're somehow seeking to normalize the idea of normalization with Lebanon.
Well, you're talking about Israel, just to remind our viewers and listeners, still occupies areas of southern Lebanon, and it still continues to violate the ceasefire by bombing areas, as you've mentioned just recently in Beirut. But where does this fit on the mandate of both President Aoun and the Prime Minister Salam? I mean, what happens to the occupied areas? Are they talking about it? Are they talking about that Israel keeps, bombing Lebanon despite having a ceasefire with Hezbollah, for example?
So let us briefly trace their position. Initially, for the listeners, Lebanon, when South Lebanon was liberated in 2000, there was still an area called Mazari' Shiba and Tilal Kfar Shuba, the Kfar Shuba Hills and the Shiba Farms. And this region, many Lebanese argue, is Lebanese. It's not Syrian. Regardless, it's occupied by Israel. Aoun and Salam have never mentioned this piece of land, which some people say is somehow an implicit concession that we're not going to seek its liberation. on top of this territory, we've had 13 points of dispute with Israel, border disputes, before the war. After the war, we had 5 major hilltops occupied on top of all of that. Now, Aoun and Salam presumably have agreed, based on the cessation of hostilities agreement that was signed between the Lebanese state and Israel through the US and France in November, to disarm Hezbollah or to evacuate any presence of armed groups south of the Litani River in return for the full withdrawal of the Israeli forces from the 5 hilltops. This hasn't happened yet. Despite that, until the bombing of the Beirut suburb 2 nights ago, Salam and Aoun have repeatedly focused on the monopoly of arms by the state, which actually favors the Israeli position. They have mentioned in passing sometimes the need for Israel to withdraw, but they haven't activated their diplomatic, they haven't mobilized diplomatically internationally. However, they have escalated their position 2 days ago. So for the first time, we see Aoun and Salam actually at least issue very harsh statements against the Israeli attack. And I think now there is a concern that Hezbollah has basically agreed to respect its end of the bargain. And I think, in my opinion, Hezbollah is pressuring Aoun and Salam and is saying, look, we've done our part. Israel hasn't done its part. You should stop pressuring us. It's time you pressure the United States and Israel. So we saw a slight shift in the last 2 days, but we don't know if this is going to be lasting, if Aoun or Salam are going to somehow, change the rhetoric, or if it's a passing moment of basically having to live up to people's expectations that they should, we have like almost 100, maybe 200 families that were displaced with these attacks 2 days ago. I can go on and on about the border areas where I come from, by the way. That's where I come from. Our villages, we can't go back and live in our villages. If we have makeshift homes, the Israelis are bombing them. We still have tens of thousands of people who are unable to return to look after their land. So it's a major, negative situation, and they are still behaving as if this is just a minor issue.
In your article, you point out how border control is another area in which Salam appears aligned with Israel's interests, with strict measures along the borders between Lebanon and other Arab countries for Shias, for example, entering and exiting, while not being concerned with the territorial integrity of the south, where Israel continues, as we've mentioned, to invade and occupy, and still occupies what they call 5 strategic points. What's going to happen with this? They just, I feel they're burying their head in the sand and ignoring what's happening in the south, as if it does not exist.
Right. First, let me point out how frustrating it is to me and many others to watch our Arab governments and leaders bicker and fight over delineating borders, especially in the Mashrib, in the Bilad al-Sham, between their respective countries, while Israel is expanding its settler colonial borders, whether we're talking about Syria or South Lebanon, or of course what's it doing in the West Bank, not to mention its current attack on Gaza. So I should add as well, I forgot to mention in the article, Salam, when he went to Damascus, he called for the extradition of Habib al-Shartouni, who's the man considered or believed to be the assassin of Bashir al-Jmayl, one of the most right-wing fascist leaders in the history of Lebanon, who is responsible for the war crimes against Lebanese and Palestinians. This is a former court judge going to Syria, being concerned about somebody who actually, possibly ended the reign of someone like Bashir al-Jmayl and called Bashir al-Jmayl a martyr. And on top of that, is busy trying to delineate the borders. I should also tell you that we have watchtowers, British-funded, built watchtowers between Syria and Lebanon border. Meanwhile, as you point out, in the southern border, we have total impunity towards what Israel is doing. we actually have warships, German and other European warships, patrolling our waters to protect Israel under the pretext of preventing the importation of arms to Lebanon. Meanwhile, we have this kind of securitization of the border with Syria. So you're right, eventually, this is what's going to happen. There are probably 2 or 3 scenarios. The first scenario, that somehow Islam and Aoun succeed in convincing the United States and the West and Israel to withdraw to the border and leave those 5, or now I think 4 points. That's the first scenario, which I think is unlikely for Israel to do that. The second scenario is for Islam and Aoun to decouple the disarming portfolio from reconstruction and somehow allow for Lebanese communities to bring money to build their homes. Now, the Aoun has appointed a Hezbollah member, or someone who is close to Hezbollah, former Minister Hamid, as advisor for reconstruction. So we don't know if there's a slow shift happening. The third scenario is nothing happens. They don't take any action. They don't help people rebuild. The Israelis don't withdraw. And at that point, sooner or later, I think, we will have to see some resistance again emerge. Now, how long will we wait until we see that emerge? That is dependent on the readiness of the resistance, its ability to build back its capacity because of the damage that it suffered from the war. So these are the 3 scenarios that we're looking at.
Well, anything that has to do with reconstruction, let's say it needs a lot of money. Where will the money flow from? I mean, I read sometimes Saudis are going to be putting some money and other sources, because now supposedly Iran is not investing, let's say, in Hezbollah and the change that happened in Syria, even the shipments that go to Hezbollah through Syria now has been stopped by the new regime there.
That's a very good question. The estimates for reconstruction range between 9 or 8 or 9 and $12 billion. After the 2006 war, it was a very different dynamic. We had Qatar and other countries come in and pour in money. We had, of course, Iran as well. This time around, you're right to point out the Gulf states overall, and especially Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, are not going to, in my opinion, put a penny, because they will not support the communities in South Lebanon who they consider to be, their opponents or enemies. Now, Iraq is a potential funder. Algeria is a potential funder. Iran, the Iranian foreign minister was in Lebanon, but there is somewhat of an implicit embargo on Iranian money coming in. We don't have Iranian airlines are not allowed to land in Beirut, by the way. So Hezbollah has already actually dispensed some money to people, maybe in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I wouldn't say more than that, which has allowed them to rent places, to renovate some of the homes. But the vast majority of the destruction is not being handled. So the question of money, on top of that, wealthy expatriates are, they can bring money, but it's never enough. We're not talking about, millions of dollars. We're talking about billions of dollars. So there is a problem with the question of money. And this is why we have a stalemate. This is why we have an unstable situation, because so long as some of these people are not able to go back to their homes, we are going to have a problem. And this is why I'm saying, if things are not resolved in a diplomatic or wise manner, we might see escalation again at the border at some point.
Well, do you feel that, I should ask you, do you feel that Israel is going to get out of Lebanon? Under what conditions, basically? I mean, let's say there is a normalization happening. Do you think that they are going to leave? I mean, we're seeing them now even expanding inside Syria. Why would they leave Lebanon when Lebanon does not really has an army that can resist Israel, and now Hezbollah is weakened?
Yeah, that's a good point. If I think both of us know Zionist history, the Israelis almost never do something, on their own without serious resistance or pressure. So I don't see them. There's no big incentive for them to leave right now. At the same time, however, the big prize is Syria. It's not Lebanon. So the only way I can see them leaving without armed resistance is if there's a regional agreement, and if the United States, because of this regional agreement, puts enough pressure on the Israelis to move out. So this will still entail, because the Israelis, they're not insisting on staying in the territory. They're insisting on the right to patrol airspace, Lebanese airspace, and on the right to strike at any point without prior notice any target that they think is possibly connected to Hezbollah. So this kind of aerial superiority is a somewhat a compensation for the failure of the Israelis to occupy more land. Let me just remind the listeners, despite the big hit that Hezbollah got, the resistance on the land were able to actually block the Israelis from going further. So what I'm trying to say is, I see only U.S. pressure as part of a regional deal that might push the Israelis to withdraw, but we still haven't resolved the question of violating airspace and having total strategic control beyond. I think Israel, by the way, it's not just Lebanon. After October 7, so long as we have this government in place, Israel's new strategic, I think, philosophy is we will not permit the emergence of any minimally equipped force that could, jeopardize our security within a large diameter territorial, so not just on the border, all the way across the region. So yeah, I don't see a short-term solution, except if there's a regional deal and the Americans pressure the Israelis to withdraw to the border.
Hicham Safieddine, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us on Arab Talk.
Thank you for having me.
Briefly, before we get to all of our topics, because I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, just is, as you've mentioned, you have a U.S.-led ceasefire efforts in Gaza appear to gain momentum. We keep hearing about these talks about ceasefire, and they gain momentum just like in the past 24 hours. And now Israel is sending a team to Qatar. Hamas has already said its conditions, accepted most of the proposal. They
Right.
have certain things which now a statement, by Israel said some of the demands by Hamas, what Hamas was seeking, are unacceptable changes to the proposal. So that's why I don't want to talk a lot about it, because in the next 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, maybe 3 days, we'll find out if this is going to work or not, because every time they come close, Netanyahu throws a monkey's wrench in the talks and derails them, and then blames it on Hamas, and that's what's been happening.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Jamal. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is flying to Washington, D.C. as we speak. He has a meeting on Monday around 6 p.m. Eastern Time with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has been making noises, as he has in the past, that peace between Israel and Hamas needs to happen, or there will be difficult consequences. In my humble opinion, it's all rubbish. I think what you said is the key here. This is part of the Netanyahu ploy to pretend that there are peace talks. In fact, it's my opinion that there will not be any peace talks that will result in any true peace in Gaza, because it's not, according to the Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his interest to create peace. Because in the meantime, Jamal, while all this rubbish talk about peace and ceasefire, Gaza continues to be decimated. The starvation is skyrocketing. The Gaza Humanitarian Fund which we reported on last week, continues to be a bit of a joke. You had hundreds of international solidarity NGOs demanding that they get out of Gaza. They are co-opting what's happening on the ground in Gaza. They are not feeding Palestinians in the way that it was intended to. And it continues to be a killing field. Palestinians in Gaza queuing for food continue to be shot and killed on a regular basis. So I'm not as optimistic. I know you're not optimistic, but I just don't see any true ceasefire or peace resulting soon.
We'll see. We'll see. That's all I
Yeah,
have to say
we'll see.
because I don't want to raise anyone's hopes, and because based on past
Right.
experience, things didn't work out. Now let's talk about our next story, Jess. The BBC invested in a documentary, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then there was a great documentary which I actually was able to watch. I should say it's great and it's depressing at the same time because and I don't want to, spoil everything that I've seen. But after this documentary was finished, the BBC refused to air it. This is a film, the BBC, that refused to air, which shows targeting, detainment, and torture of medics in Gaza. It's relentless timeline of horrors, just that kind of will not escape your mind. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And just maybe a brief recap. This film again was first commissioned by the BBC, only to be dropped when another documentary, Gaza, it's called Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, sparked a furor over supposedly impartiality. But in fact, the BBC was, as usual, hammered by pro-Israel groups, saying, don't show this documentary, it's impartial, you're only taking the Palestinian side. Here's the thing, the Palestinian side, they're showing what's happening inside Gaza. They're not allowing anyone else to go inside Gaza. There happens to be a team that kind of documented everything there. And so what are you going to be showing? This is a documentary about the killing, the torture, the murder, the bombing of hospitals, medics, etc. Has nothing to do to say, well, they're doing it. Let's be balanced and give Israel's side. And what Israel is going to tell you, that they are not, they weren't the ones who were doing it. They blame it on Hamas, as they've done that many times and got caught lying. Or they're going to say that they're bombing hospitals because there are tunnels underneath the hospitals. We've heard that story, but the pictures don't lie. Just when you see a 3-year-old with half his body burned, when you see a 5-year-old girl missing her limbs, 4 of her limbs, I mean, it's mind-boggling. Of course, you see doctors, medics getting killed, getting shot. And so that's basically the big news. Now, the other part of the news is thanks to Channel 4, which basically picked up the documentary and aired it. So you could watch it on Channel 4, and also Zeteo has been streaming it. And again, the documentary, which is The Doctors Under Attack, bills itself as a forensic investigation into claims that basically, which is the IDF has been systematically targeting Palestinian medics in all 36 of Gaza's hospitals.
Well, it's something that has been reported on extensively, Jamal. Not only have other independent media sources reported on this, not only have we seen videos and social media posts live from the medics and from the medical personnel on the ground in Gaza showing the reality of the brutality and the murderous rampage by the Israeli military. We have this documentary, and just for our listeners and viewers to kind of ground themselves, Israel has completely destroyed the healthcare infrastructure in Gaza in the last 21 months. It's completely decimated. Physicians, nurses, healthcare workers, medics of all kinds have been murdered. Close to 500 have been brutally murdered. Thousands have been arrested, Jamal, detained, and tortured in Israeli military prisons. There has been nothing in the modern era, Jamal, close to what Israel's murderous campaign and destruction of healthcare infrastructure has done in Gaza. And all this was an attempt to document it and let the world see it. I guess, Jamal, like you said, the Israeli perspective must be, well, there's tunnels, right? But that story has been debunked numerous times. So the BBC's capitulation to the Israeli power in the UK and globally continues to show itself. But thanks to the BBC and their moral complicity, I should say immoral complicity, everybody is watching this now on Zateo and watching it on Channel 4. So it's probably getting more play now than it would have
It
before.
is because it got a lot of publicity. I should mention also when we were talking about doctors, and you see the images of these doctors doing their best in overwhelmed hospitals with no water or electricity, basically racing to treat wounds that have already begun to rot. Like as I said, people lost limbs and so forth with very minimal equipment,
Right.
and then you see them coming under attack. And at the same time, because this is when we talk about impartiality, I'm not talking about just Palestinian doctors. I'm talking about doctors from England. I'm talking about doctors from Australia. I'm talking about French doctors. I'm talking about Dutch doctors. I'm talking about, those are all volunteers. I think I saw a Japanese doctor working there. I'm talking about international. So you have to kind of say, if you want to take the Israeli side, that all of them, the Australian, the Brit, the person from France, the doctor from France, all of them conspired together with Palestinian doctors to lie, you know,
Yeah, it's
and they're
rubbish.
not. And you see them. I mean, these people. In my opinion, they're heroes. I mean, to begin with, to go to such a war zone and do their best. And they are in tears when they talk about their experience. They tell you that they have been into many troubled areas during their practice. They've never seen something like this in their entire career. I mean,
Nobody
that's
has.
basically, and and
Nobody
and
has.
and that's why, in my opinion, the BBC just succumbed to Israeli pressure not to show it, and that's why, uh, transitioning to our next story, you have now for over 400 media figures, including 111 current BBC employees, call for the removal of BBC board member Sir Robbie Gibb, you know, alleging his ties to the Jewish Chronicle compromised BBC's Gaza coverage. And they're not just targeting just him. I mean, this is because he kind of played a major role in the decision making.
Right.
But the
Right.
entire establishment now is under fire. You had people who quit their jobs, they just couldn't take it anymore, and talked about what language, the censorship that they were having there, how not to mention the word genocide, how not to talk about ethnic cleansing and the language. They were doing gymnastics to avoid using these words. But on top of this, they are the ones who are behind not showing this documentary and
Right.
and censoring other reports.
Well, Jamal, the BBC has been so complicit in undermining the representation and the coverage, the independent coverage of the genocide in Gaza. We've been talking about it for not just since October 2023, Jamal. We've been talking about it for decades now about the BBC's compromised coverage. I mean, it has become a mouthpiece for the Israeli media and the Israeli Prime Minister's office. No one buys the BS. Nobody, not even the Brits, no one in Europe, nobody globally buys this kind of coverage that is being portrayed by the BBC. It has lost its credibility. The fact that these 111 current BBC employees are even saying, "Hey, what you're doing is ridiculous. it's bending to the whim of a foreign power that is committing genocide. You can't even use the word genocide at a time when, 50,000 Palestinians have been brutally murdered, conservatively. So, in my opinion, the BBC not only is tarnished, but has no credibility whatsoever.
Again, at the center of the controversy is the BBC's decision to pull a commission documentary titled Gaza
But
Medics
not
Under
just pull it,
Fire.
but Jamal, not just pull it. They asked the documentarian who they supported in making this not to even criticize the BBC. There's a special language in the contract asking or demanding rather that the people who are involved in this relationship with the BBC who did the documentary are not allowed to criticize or say anything negative about the BBC.
Well,
And
in
they don't
their,
want to even be connected.
yeah. So anyway, I'm just reading parts of their letter. The letter states, "We believe the refusal to broadcast the documentary Gaza Medics Under Fire is just one in a long line of agenda-driven decisions." And the signatories, Jess, it's a long list, including prominent figures such as actress Miriam Margolyes and filmmaker Mike Lee and actor Charles Dance and historian William Dalrymple, which all accuse the BBC of failing to meet its editorial standards. They argue that the broadcaster's reporting fails to reflect the realities in Gaza and the West Bank, citing, and I'm quoting here, a gulf between BBC's coverage and what our audiences can see is happening via multiple credible sources, including human rights organizations, UN staff, and journalists on the ground. And so I think basically they've been exposed. I mean, people have been complaining about the BBC, but now when you have people who are working there and large numbers, 111 currently working there and
Yeah.
others who used to work there, all come together and say what you're doing is basically crazy. They also, in their letter, they cited a January analysis by Declassified UK. That's a website which highlighted the BBC's limited coverage of British government and military ties to Israel, including the visit of an Israeli military chief to the UK, the use of British airspace for arms transfers and military cooperation agreements. The analysis noted scant reporting on the Royal Air Force in Akrotiri's involvement and the role of pro-Israel lobbying within the British Parliament. So they've been basically censoring or self-censoring their journalists, making them not to report on things that that's the board and the management of the BBC, and also threatening these journalists, that they will lose their jobs, and they've had it. They just like said, "This is it. We have to say something because we don't want to go down in history as being complacent or whether ignoring the facts or burying our heads in the sand or covering up." There's a 108-page study, that's what we're talking about, and basically titled BBC on Gaza, Israel, One Story, Double Standards, which analyzed, check this out, 3,873 articles on their website, 32,092 TV and radio segments from October 7, 2023 to October 6, 2024, and the findings indicate that the BBC's editorial choices consistently undermined impartiality and distorted the reality of the conflict.
Yeah, I wish I could say that's breaking news, Jamal, but it's part and parcel of the BBC. It's part and parcel of what the current UK government under Keir Starmer has been doing. They're deeply complicit with the genocide in Gaza and deeply complicit with the Israeli government and military. And we don't have time to talk about it today, but there is deep unrest and protest throughout London and the UK just in the last 48 hours of people saying, we're sick of this. They're sick of the UK government's complicity in this genocide. We'll be covering this story as time goes on, but it's not breaking news that the BBC is the handmaiden to the Israeli military and government, Jamal. I'm sorry to say that.
Well, don't claim that you apply journalistic ethics in your reporting if you're gonna, you expect that from politicians, governments, and whatever. But if you're gonna do that and ask your journalists to ignore certain stories and practice self-censorship during a genocide, and we say that as many people have been calling it, and tell them not to use the word genocide, tell them not to use the word ethnic cleansing, ignore the killing of children, ignore the targeting of hospitals. What's left? I mean,
There isn't anything left except the world opinion, Jamal, which continues to condemn. I mean, the global community understands what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, Jerusalem, Palestine. And the global community clearly has condemned Israel, does not see Israel in a positive light, to put that, mildly. But the world is beginning to see this. The governments and the mainstream media, are complicit, obviously, but the tide is turning, and people know this. They understand it very, very intimately.
so our last story, which actually we're
It's
not
related,
worthy of talking about it because we're not giving it a lot of time. It's a long
right?
report, and I recommend to our listeners and people who watch us on YouTube to go to the website of the UN Special Rapporteur. You could just Google that, Francesca Albanese, which basically you could type like from economy of occupation to economy of genocide, which is a new report again by UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese. She exposes corporate forces behind destruction of Gaza and Palestine, and not just Gaza, the West Bank, that have enabled and legitimized Israel's illegal presence and actions. And we've had, 2-3 times on our show Francesca Albanese, and I know she's very busy. So hopefully we'll have her at some
I
point
hope we
talk
can. Yeah,
talk
she
talk in
it
detail.
deserves more credit. It
Exactly.
deserves much more time. Yeah,
And
definitely.
so she presented it. She made her comments in a speech to the Human Rights Council in Geneva last week or last Thursday, and she presented her last report, which named just dozens of companies, huge companies. She said were involved in supporting Israeli repression and violence towards Palestinians. And I'm quoting here: the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory is apocalyptic. That's how she described it. Israel is responsible for one of the cruelest genocides in modern history. And as we can give you the official numbers, which you talked about, the 57,000 or nearly 57,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel. But now there are all kinds of reports that the numbers could be triple and quadruple of that, and even more. And then hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, not once, not twice, multiple times. Cities and towns have been razed, hospitals and schools targeted. 85% of the besieged Gaza has been bombarded, basically, and
Yeah.
basically destroyed.
I think Francesca Albanese's writing, and she's published multiple reports in her role as special rapporteur, will go down in history, Jamal, as among the most important historical accounts of the genocide and the murderous rampage of the Israeli government and military in this genocide of Palestinians, including the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and Jerusalem that we're seeing right now. There's a report that just came out in the last hour talking about the kind of entire West Bank being imprisoned and being choked off by the Israeli military. The illegal colonial Israeli settlers in the West Bank are laying waste. They even burned down an Israeli military post in the West Bank. So the destruction and uprooting of Palestinians throughout historic Palestine is continued unabated. And Francesca Albanese's reports will mark among the most important historical documents ever accounting for this.
Yeah, the report describes just the military-industrial complex, which we talked about, as the economic backbone of the Israeli state, saying that Israel's prolonged occupation and repeated military campaigns had provided testing grounds for cutting-edge military technology, from air defense platforms and drones to AI-enabled targeting tools. And of course, now recently, the F-35 fighter jet program, which Israel is basically testing it, on human beings. And she talks about, Albanese said that arms companies had turned near record profits by providing Israel with cutting edge weaponry to unleash 85,000 tons of explosives, 6 times the power of Hiroshima, to devastate Gaza. She mentions, of course, companies profiteering in the United States like Lockheed Martin and the Italian manufacturer Leonardo SPA. She talks about the Elbit Systems, the Israeli company, out of the UK and other European countries, and IAE, that's another Israeli company, for their role in developing drones. Even Japan profiteered. The Japanese company Fanuc Corporation, which provided robotic machinery for weapons. You go through it, Jess, and these are just the defense companies.
Right.
But then she talks about the role of the tech sector, such as giants like Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon, which played an integral part in enabling Israel's mass surveillance systems. That's why it's a long report. I recommend people to read it, research it, see if it's all truthful, investigated, whatever, because at the end of the day, Israel has denied everything in that report. She also talks about rental platforms like Booking and Airbnb, saying that they aided illegal settlements by listing properties and hotel rooms in Israeli-occupied territory. So I said it's comprehensive. It's not a report just about the recent events in Gaza. We're talking about a prolonged occupation in Gaza and the West Bank, and how these companies made billions of dollars at the expense of basically Palestinians.
Yeah, and as I said, I think that we'll have to have Francesca on in the future. She's very busy right now with all of this, but you said something which I want to just comment on about, look at it, see if you can independently verify what she has written. I can tell you, having read all of her reports, you won't find anybody more a stickler for citations, for research, for writing the kind of accuracy of her findings. You won't find anybody at the same level as Francesca Albanese. She is astute and extremely careful in all of her documentation. She is someone that leaves no stone unturned when it comes to investigating these claims. So we encourage everybody to take a look at it.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.